Hello and welcome to this session on critical perspectives for A-level language and literature. This is part of a lecture style lesson that was designed for students studying AQA A-level language and literature. It's focused particularly on Handmaid's Tale, but it'll make reference to some other key texts from this course, including Gatsby, Streetcar, poetry of Carol Ann Duffy, and there's also some references to some of the GCSE core texts there as well. So let's think first of all, what are critical perspectives and what use are they to us? Critical perspectives are ways of reading, and they come from the perspective of different ideas from psychology, from politics, or from economics. And different critical perspectives highlight or emphasize the importance of different aspects of texts, depending on which viewpoint, which critical perspective you're using. So, okay, why are we interested in this? As part of your AO3, context assessment objective on this course, you'll be looking at the final bullet point there. This is actually from a Handmaid's question. And you'll see in that final bullet point it says relevant references to literary, critical and non-academic readings from a variety of theoretical stances. That is referring to the use of critical perspectives as a way of exploring the literary context of texts. So they are useful for you there. They're also useful for you when you come to do your NEA. They can be used to give a particular perspective on an NEA text. Okay, so there are 4 perspectives that we'll look at for A-level. And they are these 4 main perspectives. There are other perspectives, of course, as well, but the ones that we'll examine in this lesson are Marxist perspective, psychoanalytical perspective, feminist perspective, and postmodernist perspectives. Okay, so first off, let's start off with Marxism. What is Marxism? It's a political and economic ideology of relationships as the foundation of an unequal society. And Marxists, they see society as a kind of conflict between entitled bourgeois classes and a dispossessed and disenfranchised proletariat, the working classes. And Marxists see everything in terms of this class division. Systems of oppression, systems of control. They are highly critical of capitalist and fascist systems of control. They really, Marxists, I suppose, see capitalism as a form of economic oppression, which is similar to fascism. The goal of Marxism has an aim. Its political aim is the overthrow of the class system, and Marxists believe that this is an inevitable process. They believe that it will happen, that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction, and that therefore this is inevitable. It's a highly influential ideology and has had huge cultural significance, huge cultural influence in the 20th century, particularly in intellectual circles. A lot of literature has been heavily influenced by it, and you'll know as well, if you know anything about 20th century politics, that it's been politically very influential. You may understand that communism and socialism are political ideologies inspired by Marxism, and that they have had a certain amount of trouble, communism particularly, as countries such as North USSR, Soviet era Russia was a sort of a failed communist experiment, and that these people who had this powerful belief in the overthrow of the class system actually ended up doing some really quite terrible things. Despite that, many people still believe in Marxism. Many people still support the Marxist ideology. A Marxist literary perspective, then, how do we apply this to texts? Marxist literary criticism seeks to examine the presentation of class relationships within texts in terms of how class relationships are presented, and they interpret events and characters as representative of the class struggle. They look at character relationships in terms of their economic status, and they also look at the economic background and ideology of the producers of texts. So they're interested in authors and society's class ideology. Where's this text coming from? They see that as a class-based question. So a Marxist reading of The Handmaid's Tale would highlight class stratification within Gilead, would look at the differences between the ruling classes and their mechanisms of control for the working classes or the dispossessed, disenfranchised Marthas and handmaids. Marxists look very much at ideas about slavery. The idea that capitalism is a form of modern slavery is a Marxist idea, and obviously the handmaids themselves and the Marthas are forms of slaves to a certain extent. So how would a Marxist interpret those class relationships in Gilead? Interpret Gatsby or Streetcar, two other core texts where class is a relevant factor. If you studied Blood Brothers, or you may have studied Inspector Calls at GCSE, you'll be aware that a Marxist would have their own way of interpreting those texts, in terms of the fact that both texts represent a form of class struggle. Okay, there's a link there that you won't be able to follow on the video, but if you do a little bit of research on YouTube, you can find out someone's done a very good Marxist criticism of Shrek, which provides a somewhat useful model for you when you think about how you apply a Marxist literary perspective to your chosen text. Okay, great beard, by the way, Marx. So goodbye to Marx and hello to psychoanalysis. Just want you to have a little look at that picture for a moment. The picture's been chosen meaningfully. The work of Sigmund Freud in the 19th century established the practice of psychoanalysis, conscious processes that dominate our behaviour. So Freud explored how human desires become repressed and they find their way into our unconscious mind, and then therefore these hidden desires, and they manifest themselves in our behaviour. One of Freud's key ideas, which has been highly influential in literature, is the idea of the Oedipus complex. Freud saw that our sexual desires, our sexual inclinations were things that were repressed during our childhoods, and that these desires centered around a need to possess mother figures and a need to seek or to be in conflict against father figures. So there's a pattern, Freud believed, of maternal desire and paternal conflict. And if you have studied any classical drama, you'll know that Oedipus is a classical tale of it's a narrative based on misidentification, loss of identity. Oedipus is adopted as a young person and doesn't know his true mother and true father, and later he travels to a strange kingdom where he meets a queen and king, I believe, and he doesn't know their true identity, and the story unfolds and has a tragic ending. So Freud himself turned to literature, I guess, to give the name to his most persuasive idea. But this is an idea about there being strong maternal desire and paternal conflict. So how does that apply to a literary text? Well, psychoanalytical critics interpret the way that imagined worlds present manifestations of unconscious desire. So our hidden unconscious desires are present in the texts. So particularly the psychoanalytical perspective might look at how characters have repressed desires or unconscious desires. They might look at the significance of dreaming for characters. They will certainly interpret the importance of familial relationships within texts, particularly mother and father figure relationships. Well, not necessarily just mothers and fathers, but relationships where there are characters who play the role of a mother or a father. They might also, of course, look at the level of the author's desires and how they might be manifested in the text. Okay, so have a think for a second, how might these ideas apply to The Handmaid's Tale? Well, a psychoanalytical critic looking at The Handmaids would certainly be inclined to interpret the commander's presentation as a paternal figure, and the kind of paternalism present in that society. They also might similarly think of particularly the commander's wife, whose name suddenly escapes me, but it's Serena Joy. Serena Joy they might look at as a maternal figure. They would also look at how they interpret Offred's relationship with her own mother through her memories. That is a relationship that's open to a psychoanalyst. Finally, they might think of how Offred's dreams offer a manifestation of her repressed desires. If you've studied the poetry of Carol Ann Duffy, you'll know that familial relationships, childhood relationships particularly, are a theme in her writing. Some of those core poems like Before You and Mine and Stafford Afternoons look at childhood experience and how that relates to the adult view of the world. More explicitly, The Cliché Kid uses a kind of a trope of a psychoanalytical or a therapy relationship to talk about confused gender identities in childhood. So that more explicitly has psychoanalysis as one of its own themes. Okay. So thanks for following so far. We've done two perspectives, the Marxist perspective and the psychoanalytical one, and the third that we look at is obviously, I suppose, the most obviously apparent relevant one to The Handmaids, and it's the feminist perspective. Now, you'll probably understand that feminism is a broad social movement for equality for women, and it encompasses almost every aspect of society. It's cultural, it's political, it's economic, it's artistic, it's to a certain extent linguistic as well. Feminists look at societies as being dominated by a male patriarchy, which is essentially misogynistic in nature, viewing women basically as inferior. Feminists interpret the way that society has been constructed around male norms. It's androcentric, I beg your pardon, and therefore has inherent biases against women. And those biases can be legal biases, cultural biases, linguistic biases, economic biases. And feminists examine the way that society marginalised women, or continues to marginalise women, and their experience of the world. You'll know that this is always a contemporary live issue in our own society. Such things as the gender pay gap. Now, clearly there has been great social progress, as the final point says, in the 20th century. You know, for example, the right to vote, the right to own property. But there is also work to be done, and feminism continues to look at ways, even subtle ways, I suppose, in which female perspectives are marginalised in society. So how would this be applied to a text? Well, feminist critics obviously look at the way that women and their social positions and their perspectives are represented in imagined worlds, and particularly they interpret how these experiences are presented in texts, whether they're presented and the way that they're presented. Frequently we find in texts prior to where the male perspectives are dominant over female perspectives. So feminists are very interested in interpreting that. They interpret the way in which imagined societies are androcentric, and they normalise this marginalisation of women. Feminist critics interpret the way that patriarchal power structures operate in texts, so male-led power structures. But they also look at the role of women, and women's behaviour towards women is a significant aspect of feminism, and that, of course, will have relevance in The Handmaids. They look at the sexual representation of women in texts, particularly attuned to things such as what we might describe as sexual objectification of women, and the treatment of women as sexual objects. So how would this apply to The Handmaid's Tale? Well, you probably don't need to read my paragraph if you've read the book. You could probably pause things here and construct your own reflection of how the feminist position might be used to interpret The Handmaids. Obviously, the relationship between women and men in the novel is in some ways its central theme. But the feminist critic would look at how this draws on historical precedents, how, I guess, The Handmaids represents a reversion of society, an undoing of the progress of the 20th century, and a return to pre-20th century norms of female behaviour, going back to its kind of the biblical precedents. And obviously that's an explicit theme in Gilead, where biblical precedents or biblical justifications are used to explain society's treatment of women. A feminist literary critic would also look at representations of women in Gilead and how these might allude to the way that women are treated in our society, or how Gilead gives us a way of evaluating our own society. A feminist literary criticism would also, of course, be interested in the essentially female nature of experience in the imagined world of Gilead, and how Offred's perspective is used to present an essentially female view of the world. Compared to other dystopias, some of the focuses in Handmaids, I guess, are essentially feminine in nature. There are Offred's preoccupation with clothing, with skincare, with shopping. These are not in many dystopias, or androcentric dystopian perspectives don't perhaps cover these aspects. It's an essentially feminist perspective. I think that a feminist literary critic would also be very interested in the way that women treat women within Gilead, and the role of with the aunts and Serena Joy, and potentially even the Marthas, in maintaining male power structures. Case studies such as Moira and Janine would be very interesting to take a feminist perspective on the way that those characters are constructed and presented. Similarly, Streetcar or Gatsby could both be subjected to a feminist literary perspective. But I think it's also interesting to think about Romeo and Juliet. Feminist revisions of Shakespeare are always interesting. It's always interesting to think about the way that Juliet is presented in Romeo and Juliet. To what extent is she the victim of a patriarchal society? To what extent does Shakespeare give her a favourable realistic characterisation as a strong, decision-making, independent woman, although really I suppose she's technically a girl? It's interesting to use that feminist critical lens to evaluate a character like Juliet. Okay, our final one, I got a bit creative with the PowerPoint here, as you can see. What is postmodernism? Well, I wrote you a little poem there in 3 bullet points. And the poem is, I guess, it's radical, it's deconstructed, it's somewhat bizarre and strange. Does it convey any meaning? Well, maybe. Postmodernism has its own critics. Many people believe that it's a way of seeing the world that's sort of nonsensical, but there's no way of arguing that postmodernism has influenced arts and culture in the 20th century. Postmodernism is difficult to define, but essentially it rejects traditional structures, and really what it does is it rejects objective truth in favour of subjective experience. And that's summed up nicely in the bold bullet point there that says, there are no facts and only interpretations. For postmodernists, they reject the idea that there's a single truth, a knowable truth, a right answer, if you like, and instead they embrace the multiple perspectives or ways of interpreting a situation. So they see great value, or they find their value, in subjective experience. And there's a few words there that sum up radical, meta, fragmented, nihilistic, so believing in nothing. That's quite a critical, quite a negative way of viewing it. Mashup, the concept of a kind of a mashup or styles, what we might call intertextuality or multimodality, to use the correct terminology, is an essentially kind of postmodernist approach to constructing texts. Contradictory, postmodern texts are sometimes quite openly contradictory. They are ironic. Irony is a postmodern feature, and they are, as I discussed before, intertextual. So how would a postmodernist criticism proceed? Well, postmodernist critics interpret the way that these are represented in imagined worlds. And in particular, their texts examine how experiences of the world are presented in fragmented ways. They look at the way that highly original structures can be used, traditional structures, or the way that traditional structures can be broken, reimagined, put back together in perhaps unusual or unexpected ways. They look at the way that texts present the subjectivity of experience. So postmodernist texts I've explained, they look at how a unique individual perspective can have the validity of a truth, if you like, is more valuable, if you like, than any facts. They also look at the way that texts self-reference and have this element of self-awareness that we might describe as meta or metafictional. So how could this be applied to The Handmaid's Tale? Well, The Handmaid's Tale is a postmodernist text, and it can be given a postmodernist evaluation. They would interpret the fragmentation of the narrative. It's a non-linear narrative. Much like the subjective experience of our own memory, it jumps around from different points in time. Offred's narrative also has a certain amount of uncertainty, a lack of clarity. There are a number of events that are described in ambiguous or opaque ways. Offred's narrative is also self-referencing, self-conscious. Her statement that this is a reconstruction, she explicitly tells her listeners, or her readers, if you like, that events are reconstructed, that events are clear. There's some points where she sort of deliberately misleads readers into these fantastic or imagined scenarios that aren't actually true. These are essentially postmodernist features of the text. The historical notes section at the end is also a kind of a postmodern device. It's quite a radical narrative shift that explains the kind of the sequencing of the narrative is not Offred's. It's been put together artificially later, but also the way that the historical notes section attempts to, or the professor, in the historical notes section attempts to use facts to present an objective way of the world, is offered as a sort of a counterpoint, I think, to Offred's own subjective account of Gilead. And I suppose that Atwood offers us these two competing notions of Gilead, or competing ways of looking at Gilead, in counterpoint, as a way of us asking what's really valuable, objective facts or a subjective experience. So it's a device, the historical notes, which create sort of critical distance for the reader, which enables us to evaluate perhaps more precisely or in a broader context what we've learned from Offred. And it reminds us that Offred's position is deeply subjective and is deeply unique and is only one experience, but I don't think it detracts from the value of that of Offred's uniquely subjective position. So it's that I put on to show what perhaps radically postmodern texts look like. You can pause here and perhaps read the opening to If on a Winter's Night a Traveller by Italo Calvino. This is the opening paragraph from it. It's written in the second person, which is a uniquely uncomfortable reading experience if you so desire. And finally, there's a poem here by E. Cummings, a poet who rejected all kinds of traditional structures. This poem is called Nothing Can Surpass the Mystery of Stillness. Okay, just to recap, I'll return, thanks for bearing with me, just to return to the opening slide there, to remind you that critical perspectives are ways of reading texts, that they're influenced by ideas, cultural ideas from a broad range of different disciplines. I suppose they show how literature and the evaluation of literature is interlinked with other social movements, psychological movements, political movements, movements in economics. These different critical perspectives emphasize the importance of different aspects of texts, and they're valuable to us when we look at using analyzing the literary context of texts, which is creditable certainly on the Imagined Worlds section of the AQA course, which is for us The Handmaid's Tale. But also creditable, I believe, in the drama section. So the final question on paper 2 also credits analysis of context, and certainly potentially very valuable to you in your NEA. As a final slide here to display to you, as a way of summarizing what you've learned here today, you should think about the vocabulary here in this glossary. Think about defining those terms that you don't understand, or thinking about how these terms here could be meaningfully applied to the texts that you've studied. Okay, thanks for your focus today. I hope this has been instructive for you, and see you next time. There's more to learn. Bye.